There is a narrative going around right now in college football that the college football playoff is broken, that it's time to make some serious changes, and I think it's time to hit the brakes just a little bit. Yes, there have been some flaws this season in our first season in college football with the college football playoffs. Some of the way the seeding worked and some of the way buys work, and I think that there's a couple things that cause these issues. But I don't know that it's time to we need to make some serious changes like everyone's saying. I think if you look at the way the format was designed, essentially 12 teams go, 5 teams have to be conference champions in order to go, and they are seeded 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the 5th champion is seeded at least 12 or anywhere higher if they happen to be a little bit higher. Now, when you actually sit and you start to look at the rankings in this season, going into this season, everyone's saying, okay, well, maybe we should just rank it so it's just the top teams. That way you don't get things like Boise State at number 3, Oregon have to play Ohio State first. But if you actually go down and you look at this and the way it ultimately ended up working out, some wild things did happen, right? You had Clemson essentially go from 16 to 12. Of course, they did beat SMU, so that would have helped them in the rankings anyway, but that allowed them to automatically take that 12 spot because they are a conference champion. Boise State jumped from 9 to 3 because they were the 3rd highest ranked champion. But when you look at the list, right, if you look at the list, it's Oregon at 1, Georgia, Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Tennessee, Indiana, and Boise State. Now, something interesting happened this year, right, where you have Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State, and Indiana. 4 teams were in the top 8, essentially, that were all in the Big Ten. Then you had 3 teams that were in the SEC. Well, where's the ACC? Where is the Big 12? And that is actually, I think, the bigger part of the problem with the playoffs, at least this year, that the college football playoffs were designed under the idea that we would have true Power 5 conferences. Well, we don't have that anymore because the Pac-12 broke apart. And with that, a few things happened. One, it allowed for the next big group of 5 champion, or possibly almost 2. I mean, if you look, Tulane, right? If Tulane had beaten Army, Tulane might have gotten in as that 5th champion. So it allowed, in a situation where we were pretty much guaranteed to have Mountain West or American champion in the playoffs, at least this year, where we have essentially just the Pac-2. The other thing that happened is that these conferences, one, got rid of divisions, which allowed for the conference championship to be decided between 2 teams that likely haven't played each other. Normally, the SEC, it's like that's when Georgia and Alabama meet, is in the SEC championship. The other thing that happened is that by the Big Ten and the SEC gaining members, right? The SEC gained, one of the Big 12's best teams, Texas. The Big Ten got Oregon. So now those teams are no longer in another division that's more spread out. So the power is more evenly spread out. Now it's all consolidated and these big teams are just banging against each other when it's actually, in a way, almost not beneficial to get into the playoffs anymore, because 5 of the 12 spots are guaranteed to conference champion members, which I think is okay. And if you actually go back and you look at some of the years past when we did have, 1, a true Power 5 conference, 2, divisions inside of these conferences in which teams would not play each other except for really the conference championship, and that would really sort of help define much more of that top 12 teams. And then 3, these conferences weren't so stacked with so many teams. I mean, Indiana, you look at the Big Ten teams that made it, right? Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State, and Indiana. Well, Ohio State played all of those teams, but Oregon did not play Penn State or Indiana, and Indiana didn't play Penn State at all. So you now have a situation where some of these teams in these conferences that are so big without divisions that would force them into playing each other, what ends up happening is now some of these teams can just get a schedule like in Indiana where they have perhaps a weaker schedule of the conference and they can be well, it's an undefeated Big Ten team or it's an undefeated SEC team, because they aren't playing each other anymore, because there's now more teams and the opportunity for them to play each other. The same thing happened. You look at the ACC, SMU, Miami, Clemson. There were a lot of teams that didn't have similar opponents. That sort of allows for that to happen. So let's go back. If you go back and you look, I'm going to pull up, I have some graphs here, and I know those of you guys listening on the podcast, you won't be able to see it, so I'll run through it. So if you go back to last year, okay? So last year, keep in mind, there's divisions. There's a true Power 5 system in college football because the Pac-12 still existed. Well, if you go back, these are the top 12 teams after the conference champion weekend last year: Michigan, Washington, Texas, Alabama, Florida State, Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Missouri, Penn State, Ole Miss, and Oklahoma. So with the current rules in the college football playoff system, with the 5 champions going, under last year's system of the Power 5 conferences, the way they were designed last year, well, your top 5 teams are your top 5 champions. Michigan in the Big Ten, Washington in the Pac, Texas in the Big 12, Alabama in the SEC, and Florida State in the ACC. So the system would have totally worked last year, and it totally would have made sense. And I think that's where you can look, and I have the year before as well, and I'll go into it here in a minute as well. But I think that's one of the things where, this is 1 year. It's hard. It's easy to look and say, well, it's flawed. You have to give it a couple years to see, is it going to work? Is, the Pac, we know it's gaining some Mountain West members. Are we really going to build up another conference? And with the Big Ten and the SEC pulling so far ahead, even from the ACC and Big 12, are we going to see some teams actually leave those conferences? And I think they might, because now the way it works is there's 2 ways to get in. You can either be a conference champion, which is 5 spots, or you can be one of the 6 teams that has a very good resume, and that could include a conference champion as well. So, more conference champions obviously can go, but the top 5 champions go. Okay. So essentially right now, if the top 5 champions go, it's likely to be under this year's rules, which is what happened: SEC, Big 10, ACC, Big 12, and then your next best group of, well, really 6 schools this year, if you want to, depending on how you want to view the Pac, which did allow a Boise State to go. So if I were actually one of these middle of the road teams, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, but let's just say, for example, I don't know, Michigan, right? If Michigan this year, not that they would ever leave the Big Ten, I'm just using them as an example, but Michigan this year, I think, won 8 games. So if you took Michigan out of, say, the Big Ten and you put them into the American and they go, maybe undefeated, you could still have your rivalry against Ohio State, which they won this year. But if you're now an undefeated American champion, are you not the 5th best champion? Would it not actually be more beneficial? Because all you got to do is get into the playoffs. That's it. And yes, I know there's money involved and there's all these other things that are involved into it as well. But purely from a standpoint of talking about trying to get into the playoffs and win the championship, everybody has just as much of an opportunity as everybody else. And in fact, actually, there's more money in making it to the playoffs, because you have an opportunity to play in these bigger televised games, than there is to sit in one of these mega conferences and be a middle of the road team year in and year out. You'd actually almost, I think, be more beneficial to split some of these conferences up. Certainly we need divisions, but if some of these conferences were to actually get split up a little bit, then I think the competition would sort of return to the way that we remember and we think about it. Let me go back another year. The rankings were Georgia, Michigan, TCU, Ohio State, Alabama, Tennessee, Clemson, Utah, Kansas State, USC, Penn State, Washington. Now, the playoffs ended up being Georgia, Michigan, TCU, and Ohio State. And, if you remember correctly, that ended up being a Georgia TCU national championship in which Georgia absolutely obliterated TCU. 65-7. I mean, it was terrible. That was under the 4 schedule. TCU, however, was not its conference champion. So if you go back and you look, and the same thing happened where Utah actually won it. And so if you look at the rankings of 2 years ago, under this current system, it would be Georgia, Michigan is your Big Ten champion. Then, your next few teams are TCU, Ohio State, Alabama, Tennessee. Well, none of those teams were conference champions. So now you'd have Clemson, who would be the ACC champion, would jump from 7 to 3. That's not as wild as what Clemson did this year, which is like 16 jumping into 12 over in Alabama. I mean, because they're the conference champion. Utah was 8th, but they would actually jump to 4 because they were the next highest rated conference champion. Yeah, so Kansas State actually beat TCU, but they would still be in. But the rankings would move around a little bit, and so it would actually end up being Georgia, Michigan, Clemson, Utah. Then it would go TCU, Ohio State, right? So that's really what this system was designed for. It was really designed to move teams from like 8 to 9 to 3 to 4 because they won their conference championship. It really wasn't designed to be moving like teams from like 16 to 12 or, who knows? I mean, with so many of these teams in these bigger conferences right now, I mean, in theory, you could move from like 21 to 12 because of the way like this works if everyone's beating up on some of these lower conferences. So I don't know necessarily that the playoff system is the problem. I think right now part of the problem is the way that these conferences have changed and shifted, because there's 18 teams in the Big Ten. Like, that's absurd. There's 17 teams in the ACC. So without even divisions, some of these teams aren't playing each other. And so it's changing the rankings so much week by week to get a true representation of just how good teams are.